Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Seattle Angel Workshop Series. Today, we're going to talk about something that's a little bit to the side of angel investing in startups, but it runs straight into the middle if you pay attention. And I'm John Seacrest, and I run the Seattle Angel Conference. My goal is to make stronger ecosystems by making more angel investors who then invest in smarter companies that make more angels, and we build the positive feedback loop. So we have a Seattle-based one, which ends up being North America, and we have a transatlantic one, which is North America and Europe. And we use these workshops as a way of sort of building vocabulary and fundamentals in that, try and bring that conversation into the broader way. But we also run an open coffee every Tuesday, run a series of workshops around this with the goal of trying to help people who are interested in changing the world to become fund managers. So we run a fund manager peer learning group as well. But today, we're going to re-engage with Rick. Rick has worked with us before around this question of doing a donor advised fund, and we've had the conversation in a very specific way in the past, and so now we'll be a little bit more general about what this is. Can you introduce yourself up, and then we will just let you dive right in.
Sure. Rick Davis. I am based in Austin, Texas, and part of a firm called LOHAS. We are, operating at the intersection of impact investing and philanthropy, and do a variety of things in that area, including running a donor advised fund that is focused heavily on enabling the flow of philanthropic funds into private sector, for-profit, socially, environmentally impactful ventures. As John mentioned, actually did a webinar with him and our administrator of our donor advised fund and some of our other philanthropic programs here. John, I'm guessing, is that 4 years ago or so? I'm trying to remember the timeline when we did this previously, but this is an area that is getting more and more traction and interest from an investment perspective, and so thought we'd provide some updated perspectives on that.
Yeah, it was after COVID started, so it's only 3 years ago.
Just seems like 4?
Yeah, just seems like 4.
Excellent. The idea here that when John and I talked about this was really to look at the use of donor advised funds and similar sort of philanthropic programs through the eyes of the angel investor community, the early stage investor community. And what John had asked is that we assemble some use cases, and that's sort of what we've put together here to walk through. So everyone, I provide a little bit of background on what donor advised funds are, but largely, okay, so what do we do with them? So that's what we're going to go through here today. If I can actually get it to go, there we go. So, from an agenda perspective, the idea here, like I said, is to walk through some various use cases. And what I thought was a good way of starting that is just common questions we hear. We work with lots of investors and lots of social enterprises and impact venture funds and things of that nature. And so here are 6 questions that we often hear, and I'm gonna line them with some use cases that follow for each, and try to line them up in what I thought of as sort of basic intro to donor advised funds up to advanced use of how this might work. And so,
well, we heard earlier from Brad, like he said, donor advised fund, whatever that is. So
yep,
let's be
definitely
pedantic.
That's starting on the basic side, and then we will walk right through that area. So that's actually the next slide. We provide a little bit of background just so we have some context. But things we often hear, okay, what are good types of investments for my DAF funds? What questions should the companies I've already invested in be asking investors as it relates to DAFs? We have talks with parties about how to use these kinds of structures to de-risk their investment positions. One of the things that we're very big proponents of are family involvement in DAFs, and so we'll talk about that. We hear about that quite a bit. And these last 2 definitely fall more into the advanced category, but in using donor advised funds, we hear people sometimes say, hey, look, I love the idea, but I hate to bypass some of that future upside if I'm investing into my DAF. Is there a way to manage that? And in a similar vein, sort of at the far end of the sophistication spectrum, the ability to obtain tax deductions and financial returns using these kinds of structures is something we'll explore here briefly as well. And so that's the starting point. Clearly, we can divert away from this at the end if parties have questions, but thought this would at least provide some good background and do it in the context of things that we tend to hear about quite a bit. So just very quickly about us, as I briefly mentioned on the front, LOHAS, we're a 7-year-old firm. We actually have 7 partners spread across New York, Texas, and California, operating at that intersection of impact and philanthropy. We manage Donor Advised Fund, as I said, focused heavily on impact investing, and really with a focus around investing in the ventures of our donor clients' choice, which is an important distinction, meaning we don't have like a pre-approved list of investments. We want to enable what our donors want to invest in as long as it's impact. And we're doing that with no minimum investment amounts, which can be another limitation that other parties may face. We work, as it relates to donor advised funds, we work with individuals and families, and frequently their financial and investment advisors, private wealth managers, CPAs, things of that nature. We also manage nonprofit programs geared to supporting impact investment funds, by allowing them to receive tax-deductible charitable contributions that we invest in their funds. Under that program, we work now with dozens of venture and private equity impact funds touching, pretty much every corner of the social environmental impact space. You name it, we're probably working with a fund that's investing in it somewhere. So to the question that was asked, what is a donor advised fund? DAF, as we are apt to call them, the main benefits of a DAF. These are, philanthropic vehicles where you can set aside money, obtain an immediate tax deduction for that year, and deploy it at some later date. Notably, there is no specificity on what that later date is or how much money needs to be spent at any given time, which makes it very different than, say, a traditional foundation. There's also often a greater tax deduction threshold, no distribution minimums, as I mentioned, fewer reporting requirements, and a great degree of privacy compared to a typical private family foundation. So they have become, and probably this should be a bullet on this page, but they have become the most commonly used philanthropic avenue in the United States. And importantly, from an investor perspective, we now have well over $250 billion stuffed inside of donor advised funds in this country. Much of that is in the sort of largest banks, think Fidelity, Charitable, Schwab Charitable, Vanguard, but also in a variety of other, community foundations and the like. You name it, there's a lot of money out there in donor advised funds. Some of you may already use a DAF, and this is talking about how those funds can be used. DAFs are also great ways to offset your tax bills using things other than just set-asides of cash, accredited stock, real estate, collectible art, crypto, you name it. There are DAF sponsors, ourselves included, that will absorb those things as a way to generate tax deductions and then ultimately funds that you can disperse. And this bullet here in the bold is really the key of the focus of our discussion today. DAFs have the ability to invest those funds in social environmental impact companies, funds, projects, or entertainment productions of your choice. And the entertainment side is maybe a different one for those of you on this call, but we do a lot in the social impact entertainment space, and certainly encourage parties to use their donor advised funds to invest in that next production with message and meaning. And importantly, for this discussion, it's a way to use risk-free donated capital to explore the world of impact investing. And when I say risk-free, the idea here is these are funds, to be clear, that you have already set aside and obtain your tax deduction. Technically, they are not even your funds anymore. They belong to the philanthropic vehicle to where you donated them, but you maintain advisory rights. That's the A in DAF. And with those advisory rights, you can advise on where they should be deployed. And as I said, the idea here is that you can advise that they be invested in impact companies and the like. And so these are funds you set aside, so your expected return on that investment is negative 100%. You get a tax deduction, but those funds are very real to the parties that might receive them, and so this is a way to do that. So I'm gonna jump right in, unless there's any particular questions on the DAF itself, and if there are, John, if you could read any questions that get posed in the chat that are relevant,
Yep.
I'm happy to address them as we go.
Yeah, happy to do that. Let me toss one in. You're using code words for people that are sort of early, and you
Yep.
say invested in, and I want you to be explicit. So I can donate things with grants to people, and that's how people think about philanthropic donations. But you just said the word invested, which means money comes back. So
Correct.
what are the kinds of vehicles that I could use for the investing thing?
You can set aside, the idea is to set aside, to make a donation of funds or assets into your donor advised fund, obtain that tax deduction, and then those assets are in there. You can certainly donate them to a charity that accepts donations. But what we're saying is you can also invest them in private sector for-profit companies that have a social environmental impactful component. And when you make those investments under the same terms that every other investor is using, meaning if it's a impact company in the climate space and they have a safe note that they're raising $500,000 from and you want to put in $100,000 out of your DAF or $10,000 out of your DAF, whatever, you would sign off, or more accurately, the donor advised fund would sign off on the same investment documents that everybody else is participating in that same safe note. And when returns come back from that investment, they would flow back into your donor advised fund, where you could then ideally make the next investment or donation out of your DAF. But it very much is an investment of funds, and the DAF gets treated like every other investor in the deal.
So then a second question, just so that we're a little pedantic about it. Yeah. If I am writing an angel investor check, I have to be accredited. And so if I have a donor advised fund, what's the relationship with this accredited thing that they've gotten Reg D 501?
Yep. Our DAF at least is an accredited investor. I would think DAFs that are doing investing, and it should be clear that most donor advised sponsors do not allow or enable donor advised funds to be invested in private for-profit deals. We do. We're one of a handful of DAF sponsors that do. But we are definitely an accredited investor, and I would assume that any other DAF sponsor out there that's allowing impact investments is also an accredited investor to satisfy those requirements. Yeah.
So if you have 5 million in assets, then by federal law, you're accredited.
Yeah, and the donor advised fund has far more than that. Cool. And we're investing in things out of our DAF domestically and globally. So there's not there aren't any limitations in that respect.
Right. Excellent. Thank you.
Okay, well, let's and like I said, John, if questions pop up, because I'm not tracking that at the same time, feel free to stop me and bring them to my attention. We can stop along the way. But why don't we talk about just the very basic use case here of investing with your donor advised fund, and specifically the question of what are good types of investments to use for my DAF. The ideal candidate here, or maybe the most frequent candidate here, are early stage, high risk social environmental impact ventures. The idea here being, if something is attractive to you, not only because it appears it could be a successful company, but also of the good things that they will achieve through their success, but you're not blind to the fact that it is a high risk endeavor. This may be a way to help them make those first dollars in, or some of those first dollars in, using funds out of your DAF that, once again, are risk-free in nature to you because you've already set them aside, allowing you to maybe reserve some future investment funds to put in that company or others, limit some of your investment exposure if you've already made a number of investments, but would still like to support the company or the fund. You can even do both. You can invest in the company out of your normal portfolio, and then have some of your other capital commitment to the company come out of your DAF, which obviously helps de-risk the overall exposure. And in that scenario, when the company issues returns, the funds that were invested out of your own portfolio will return to that, and the funds that are invested out of your DAF, in a pro rata way, would return to it. So for future employment at per your advisory. We always talk about encourage your fellow investors to do the same, because if these are companies you're investing in, if it's a way to better capitalize the venture, that's to everyone's benefit. And as I mentioned, if and when there are financial returns, invest those funds, those returns in the next impact venture. That's the idea here. So
yeah, I want you to use the word regenerative capital for that returning, right? So I'm not using philanthropic capital that changed things and then goes away, but I'm using regenerative capital that then comes back bigger and better so that I can do more of the same. Yeah. Thank you.
That's absolutely right. I mean, this is sort of the core of our focus, is enabling where we see the greatest impact can be achieved through what we typically think of as sustainable models, but is very much regenerative capital. Instead of just making charitable donations, investing in things that have a sustainable model to generate impact on an ongoing way, but also issue or generate returns that can be reinvested in similar areas or companies to support more and more. The for-profit model, the regenerative model, is very much at the core of our firm.
Yeah. So Prasad asked the question of whether the returns that you get in your donor advised fund investments generate further tax credits.
They do not. They go back into your DAF. It'd be fantastic if you had a 10x return, because then you just have 10x more funds to invest in the next impact venture. But there's no additional tax ramification for that.
And you don't pay taxes on the capital gains.
No, definitely not. Okay, why don't I move to the next as we sort of go up the scale of strategies here and things to think about when using DAFs. So this one is for the social entrepreneurs in the audience as well, and clearly all of you who have invested in companies that have a social enterprise element. These are basic questions that every impact company leader or fund manager in whose venture you've invested should be asking their current or prospective investors. Do you have a donor advised fund or private family foundation? If they say, yes, I have a DAF, you should ask them, did you know that you could be investing those DAF funds in my venture? The interesting aspect here is, as I mentioned earlier, donor advised funds are the most common and popular philanthropic vehicle, and we have many billions of dollars stuffed inside them, but virtually nobody knows that they can be investing that money in things like you're investing. So if the companies in which you're investing aren't asking their would-be investors about this, not only will they not know who has the money, the donor would never know they could be investing it. And it doesn't matter where those philanthropic funds are currently housed. If they're stuffed someplace that won't allow them to invest in the particular company, we will, and others like us will. So, move them over at no cost and allow that to be invested in whatever the deal is. If to that same question, if they say, they do have a family foundation, you should be asking them, did they know they could be granting those funds into a nonprofit that financially supports my venture? So the idea here is not that you're seeking an investment from that foundation or the company seeking investment. I mean, clearly they can and should, but also that there's an ability to absorb grant funds as well. And if the foundation's like, well, I hate to bypass the opportunity to get returns, that grant can even be structured as a recoverable grant. So there are lots of ways here to be able to absorb at a company level these kinds of funds. But as the point at the very bottom makes, if you don't ask the question, you're never going to know. Because one of the keys of donor advised funds is they are anonymous. Meaning who on this call has a DAF is only known by the parties on this call. There's not a database you can go to say, hey, Bob has a bunch of money in his DAF. Only Bob's going to be able to tell you that. And the only way you're going to be able to know that is if you ask Bob, hey, do you have a DAF? Did you know you could be investing it in my fund? So these are questions that have to be asked, or nobody will ever know on either side, neither the investor nor the company raising the money. John?
Evan has his hand up.
Yep, that's what I saw.
Yeah, sorry. I was wondering, can DAFs invest in SPVs that are the issuers of private businesses?
Yes. I mean, we are focused on enabling impact investing, but if that's the point of the SPV, Yes, definitely.
Okay. And then there's a little discussion in the chat about vehicle versus specific DAF. And so I was wondering, there's a number being tossed around. It's 5 million in assets under management. I was wondering, is that the minimum requirement to have a DAF, or like, sorry, I'm missing that conversation.
No, I think that may have been related with John was saying earlier about accredited investor. That you have to have something in that vein to be an accredited investor. I don't know. I'm not looking at the chat, but that's not relevant here. There's no minimum to set up a DAF. You can set up a DAF, with $10 if you really wanted to. That seems like a hassle to get a $10 tax deduction, but there's not a minimum in setting something up, at least not with our donor advised fund. And there's no requirement that you have allocate any percent of it at any given time or by any given date.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hi, I think you're calling me. This is groundbreaking stuff for me. I had never considered this, even though I utilize donor advised funds frequently. How popular is this strategy? Like you said, there's a few firms that are doing it, but is this a pretty popular or like widely known thing within the donor advised community or the people that utilize donor advised communities? Or would the task be for entrepreneurs to be educating individuals that have DAFs of this opportunity?
It's very much the latter. It's a great question. That's the point I was making on this last note here. If you don't ask, you'll never know, nor will they, because most parties who have a donor advised fund have no idea they could be doing this. So I think we always joke it's like the PSA for impact companies. Like, if you don't educate them, they'll never know, and you'll never know if they have one. So it's a two-way piece of education.
And then follow-up question on that. I know of a lot of different donor advised funds, especially like regionally based, like Seattle has a huge one. How do you know, or what do you look for in those groups to find if they do support that? They don't publish it.
You don't. That's the key. Like if you went to the local community foundation and said, hey, which of your donors might be interested in making investments out of their DAF, they're not going to tell you, because by definition, that's protected information. Their donors are anonymous. How much money they have in their donor advised funds is anonymous. The only way you're ever going to know is speaking directly with those donors or the families and saying, do you have one? And did you know you could be investing in it? And typically, then that's why we put it in the context of this question. These are questions should come up during that pitch conversation. Hey, I've come to you. You're, perceived as a wealthy individual, you're a family office, whatever it may be. I'm talking to you about my company or my fund and this amazing stuff we're doing. And as a closing comment on that, particularly if they're expressing an interest in whether they're specifically interested in investing in the company or the fund, but if they're leaning into the impactful area that you're addressing, certainly you should be asking all of them. And by the way, do you have a donor advised fund, or do you have a private family foundation? Did you know those funds could be deployed as investment in my company?
Okay.
Yeah. And in the context of Seattle, for example, the Seattle Foundation is happy to take your donor advised fund, but won't let you do angel investing. It has to stay grant because they're very narrow in their interpretation of everything. And so there are at least two that I know of, and Rick keeps saying more. So there's probably some other ones around the corner.
Yeah, it is a very small percentage, though. I mean, the front part of your question. I'd guess 1% of DAF sponsors out there are enabling this kind of activity. Maybe it's 2%, but it is a small handful. I mean, there are hundreds of DAF sponsors. This is just we have a small peer group.
But if we transfer it through LOHAS, then there's an opportunity.
And we do that every day. People come to us from Schwab and Fidelity saying, hey, I have a company and it's not on their pre-approved list or a fund that I really want to support. And we're like, not a problem. We stand up a DAF for them at no cost. We transfer the funds over at no cost, and we help them invest in whatever that deal is.
Okay. Thank you. Awesome.
Okay. Why don't we keep going? We can always circle back to any of this stuff as we move along. So sort of moving up the sophistication spectrum. If you're an investor, one of the things we hear a lot about is de-risk. How do I de-risk my position using my DAF? And what I think of it often is, how do I preserve my position using my DAF? And so, if you've already invested in something and you still believe in the company, but they need more money, and you are reluctant from a financial perspective to invest further funds at this stage in the company, you're in that in-between zone that angel investors find themselves often, and early stage investors in general find themselves in often. Do I continue to financially support this company at the stage it's at? This is an ideal use case for a donor advised fund. You can help the company reach its next stage while preserving without risking further capital, but preserving your original investments position.
So I'd like to restate what I just heard you say.
Please.
So as an investor, I'm writing my piece of my check into the seed round of a company. Turns out the company needs a seed plus round. I've already allocated my share of my asset class called angel investing, but I don't want them to be suffering along the way, and I want to fill in that bridge thing. I take my donation money that I've already put in my DAF and I invested in that company, and I'm using a different asset class and I have a different return structure because I've already been paid for that in my tax credit, right?
You're exactly right.
I get a negative 70% return on my money because I got a 30% tax credit on it, essentially, right?
But you also have preserved your original seed investment in your hypothetical there, John. So if the alternative was they don't hit that C plus round and maybe they don't live to fight another day, using those donated funds keeps them going, and maybe they ultimately do pop and get over that hump, then you have that early stage investment preserved in that company, and ideally that turns into something meaningful.
Right, and that gets me to my public service announcement that early pre-seed investors probably should not be following on because the company is floundering, because provably from the data that turns into further loss of funds, good money after bad. But if your entity that is a third-party entity is investing and they decide to do it and you decide to follow them, then you have more validation that the company is not just throwing things down a hole. Sorry.
Well, no, I think it's great feedback. We're working with a company right now that raised a bunch of money from early stage investors around some very good technology. Ultimately, it appeared, it proved that the CEO was not a good CEO, just in preserving and growing those funds. And the board stepped in and removed that CEO and found somebody new to step in. And that after a forensics case, that new CEO said, you know what? This technology really is good. He just was not very good at creating this company, and has gone back to those investors, someone who has a lot of credibility. And those investors are, we definitely want to see if we can help this company, live to fight another day, and preserve our original positions. And that's a scenario where you're like, okay, things have changed. There's still very good underlying tech. I now have faith in the leadership. I recognize it needs more capital if it's going to get this next, swing at the plate. And that's an ideal use case for, investing at your donor advised fund. Clearly, it's a little more risky. You'd like, everyone's seen the data you just showed or just talked about, but it may be one of those scenarios you really would like to see if you can help it get to that next stage. And that's a great use case for donor advised fund type dollars.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's similar. That last bullet there just talks, these things come up with LP commitments and funds as well, unexpected or untimely commitments. Here's a use case. If it's an impact fund, here's another use case for an investment of donor advised fund dollars.
Can you tell me why you keep saying mission and impact fund as part of the words here?
Well, I keep saying impact fund or impact company or venture, things of that nature.
Yeah, there's a structural reason you're saying that, and I want to be explicit about it.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. Legally speaking, DAFs can invest in anything they want. However, as we talked about earlier, very few donor advised fund sponsors allow investments in private sector companies. Those that do, like us, are only supporting that in ventures that have some sort of social environmental impact. I'm not aware of a single DAF sponsor that is facilitating DAF investments into a company or a fund or a project that doesn't have some sort of underlying social or environmental impact element to it.
Can you list some of the broader ranges of impact? So
Yeah,
people
I
can
mean,
get,
so as I mentioned, we work with dozens of impact investment funds. They're investing in, a lot of diversity issues, gender, and that has a lot of different, is it companies led by diverse founders? Is it funds run by diverse founders, or investing in those kinds of issues? Climate is obviously a huge issue, impact issue, but health, education, housing, food, regenerative agriculture, oceans. I mean, we seem to touch every corner. We're talking to a fund right now that is investing in companies combating human trafficking. Like it's you can, if there's a cause out there, there is more and more creativity around finding for-profit models to address that challenge, which we all should be very encouraged by.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you.
Any more questions on this area currently?
Yeah, Laura's starting to ask somewhat detailed questions. So Laura, how about if you just come on up and we'll take care of it. If you would raise your hand, it'll make it easier for me to spotlight you.
Sorry.
Laura?
Can you hear me?
I can, yes.
The question is around participation going forward. So if you invest in an angel round, in the example that was given before, like you come in an angel round, and then there's a bridge to the next round, and you're not really sure, but you're saying, okay, I'll use my DAF for that, and then you realize they're doing well, so you want to participate in the seed round. What does your total participation look like? Like if you're like, okay, I want my pro rata, is that angel plus DAF, or is there a different distinction?
Well, I mean, whatever funds are invested out of the DAF, the pro rata returns from that go back to your donor advised fund. Everything.
But I think she's using the word pro rata as her rights to invest in the next round.
Yes.
And so,
yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you, John, for helping me better understand the question. Ultimately, it's up to the company how they view that. But if they are smart, and we talk to funds about this as well, and in fact, even in the previous slide or so, we talked about making some of your some of your investment out of your portfolio and some out of your DAF to meet your capital commitment. It's certainly in the best interest of the company or that you're investing in to see this all as your money as it relates to how they value you in the stack. Whereas technically, when the returns are paid, the portion that came out of your DAF will go back to your DAF, and the portion that came out of your portfolio will go back to you. But as far as meeting certain thresholds of overall investment, it should all be attributed to you, because even if it's coming out of your DAF, you're the one that's advising that that's where the money be invested.
Okay, thank you.
Laura, did I answer your question?
You did. Thanks,
okay.
Rick.
Good. Okay, why don't we move to the next idea here, because it's one of my favorites. And that's, why might I involve my family in my DAF deployment decisions? And one of the things that we think of DAFs is as great tools for family investment education. It's an ideal structure, fund pool to impart investing basics to children, grandchildren, mentees, whatever the form they might take, because it's an opportunity to use risk-free capital to teach, deal sourcing, due diligence, investment management skills, where it's funds that have already been set aside, but are very real things that you should be thinking of as an investor, that each of you have studied as investors to get better at. And here's a way to impart that to the next generation or parties that you're trying to work with. We've also found it can be a very powerful bridge within the family between generations, in the sense that maybe, I'm sure this isn't anyone's family here, but it's not uncommon for us to come across families where older generations don't have the same perspective on things as younger generations and the same interest in things. But there may be some real key knowledge in those older generations of investors, and this is an opportunity for them to impart that to those younger generations around topics that the younger generation is actually interested in. Some impactful company or fund or project that they can work on together, where you're able to teach the basics of investing, but doing so in an area that is ideally of great interest to that child or mentee. It can also, because of that sort of generation building, can be a great way to unlock family controlled funds, because sometimes DAFs are actually family DAFs, not just individual DAFs. and you need like everyone to vote on, hey, where do we send the money? And this can be a way to get the whole family engaged and excited about something versus trying to figure out what that one charity is everyone's going to agree on. And so, it's a really interesting educational tool. And as I noted earlier, it doesn't have any direct financial impact on you, the DAF holder, but it's very real capital to the impact venture getting it. And then for those reasons can be, it's a real use case from an education perspective. It's not a hypothetical. It's very real, and provides a very strong educational and investment learning environment.
I'd like to dive into that rabbit hole a little bit deep here.
Please.
So if I have a DAF, then anybody can donate to that DAF. So I can stand on a street corner with a sign and say, here's my number or my QR code, donate to my DAF. People throw the money in and I can raise money. So as a 13-year-old, I can go to all of the parents of my friends, get them to put money into my DAF, and then I can invest it however I want because I'm accredited functionally in the system, right? And so if I'm a high school student or I'm a college student and I would like to build investing skills, I can first go raise funds by doing the donation marketing process and then deploy the funds, and all of the pieces are directly available to me with no limitations on all the magic rules about how old or how wealthy I am.
If you're investing them in things, yes. What you can't do, and I don't think this is what you intended, but I do want to make the distinction. If it's your own company, you can't take your DAF money and invest it in your company. Right. There are ways to manage that that we work with, but donor advised funds aren't one of those tools for that specific use case. But to your original point of, can you get parties to contribute money into your DAF where they get a tax deduction? Yes. And then can you take that pool of DAF funds and invest it in a company or a fund or whatever you may want? As long as it's not your company or your fund, yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's a really powerful opportunity for people to become skilled fund managers without having to hit social validation limitations of institutional LPs.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
And we have another question.
Ramiro has his hand up.
Yes, John, just would you please clarify where does the accreditation requirement come in there on the 13-year-old example? So what needs to be accredited? The entity, the persons where the 13-year-old is raising money from, the 13-year-old? I'm a little bit lost there.
When you donate the money to the DAF, the entity that is holding the DAF, the sponsoring entity, has to have at least 5 million in assets. If they do, then by federal law, they are accredited. And almost all of the ones that are doing this have vastly more than that. So it's just not a question at all. And so I, as a donor, donate money into this little pocket of this much larger thing, and I get to control where the money in that pocket goes because I'm the advisor.
So neither the donor nor the 13-year-old that are raising money need to be accredited. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So only let's say, let me use, maybe this is the wrong word, but only the custodian or money manager needs to be accredited, right?
Yes.
That's the donor advised fund itself, the sponsoring organization. Like our DAF is an accredited investor. Anyone who donates in it and then invest that money comes in as an accredited investor in the deal.
Okay, and the tax deduction paperwork in that same example of 13-year-old, that comes out of the sponsoring organization as opposed to the 13-year-old, right?
No, the tax credit comes from the donor into the fund. So if you get it, I go and I talk to my neighbor, Mrs. White, and she donates $100, she gets the credit.
She gets the tax deduction, not credit. It's a tax deduction.
Oh, sorry, deduction.
Okay, and there is no exchange of paperwork where, like a Form 10 something that somebody has to give to the donor.
If a donor makes in John's example, makes a contribution to the DAF and makes it into John's DAF or her own, it doesn't matter. Either way, she's going to get tax deduction documentation saying you have made a contribution to a charitable, to a charity, and you have that $100 tax deduction that you can apply to your taxes.
Okay,
And that's the task of the sponsoring entity that holds the DAF.
got it. And in the middle is a 13-year-old that is basically like brokering, brokering that type of.
Well, they're the
transaction.
advisor to the fund.
Advisor to the fund. Got it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. So in donor advised fund, that A means advisory. And so they maintain the advisory rights over their donor advised fund. And they're advising, for example, if they were our client, they would be advising us to invest in the particular company, or deal that they're wanting to invest in.
Thank you.
Cool.
So they're almost like a dotted line investor. They are guiding where the money goes, but technically it's the donor advised fund that is the investor in the deal.
Right. And the money goes back to the fund, not to the advisor.
Correct. That is also correct. So in your scenario, everyone gets a tax deduction, but the money is invested in the deal. And when the returns come back, it'd come back into your donor advised fund, or the donor advised fund that was the central offset point.
Rick, and when you said that the money comes back to the fund, so meaning to the fund that is within the sponsor organization, and the advisor
Still has advisory rights over those returns. That's exactly right.
Okay, yes, it has advisor right, but it does, the advisor doesn't get any tax return, only the donor, right?
Only the donor. That's right. The donor or donors are the ones that get tax deductions for the amount they donated. It has nothing to do, like, they don't get more tax deduction if it turns out to be a good investment, or less if it doesn't. They get a tax deduction based on exactly how much they contributed.
So JP has a question, and we'll add him to the spotlight. What's your question, JP?
So Rick, hi, and John, thank you for this. I've actually known about DAFs for a while. I've never used them. And my understanding is exactly what we were just talking about, that the money, if it ever has a positive return, is returned to the DAF fund. The DAF fund then recycles that, with the same advisor, into new investments, which is the purpose of regenerative capital. Should somebody say, hey, that was a really fantastic return, I'll take the capital gains and pay my capital gains tax. Can I reverse that investment, unwind the original donation to the DAF and make it into an investment and get my profits out of that?
You can't, but
you can't have a mulligan in DAFs. Okay.
You cannot, but interestingly enough, JP, the next two slides address these kinds of issues and sort of a nuance on that. And so I'll preserve my response till you see the next couple of slides, and then you can chime back in and ask more questions.
Cool.
Because we're trying to raise a fund. And what happens if your fund is very profitable, JP? Well, should that happen, you'll feel good, but you won't get a return.
and I will address that here momentarily. And I see another question, John.
Yeah, Brad, I see your hand up. I'll bring you up.
Thank you. Thank you, John and Rick. Okay, I've got two questions. One is, can a DAF spin off a company? Like it's got some IP.
What do you mean by spin off a company?
Well,
what do you mean by spin?
Maybe ask us the second question first, and you'll get to where I'm going from. So, can I donate my startup to a DAF?
You mean your interest in a DAF, like your shares in your startup? Can you donate those into a DAF?
If I have a startup and it's a good idea, but it didn't get the traction, and we decide to liquidate it, can we then move the IP and the prop and everything into a DAF, donate it to a DAF?
You can, but for what purpose? Help me understand.
Certainly. Well, then it goes into the DAF.
Wait. Let's make sure we're correct. Donor advised funds I think the important part is funds.
Okay,
Right?
okay.
And
Are
so-
you not?
and I
I thought that's why I was asking the question, John. I was wondering is because you believe they can be liquidated and achieve funds, or is it something different you're envisioning?
I'm more envisioning, say there's a really good idea, this a socially acceptable idea that could help humanity, literally, and it was before its time, perhaps, and but you're rather than just completely liquidating the company and not going anywhere, you can move the assets in the company somehow rather into a DAF. The DAF then takes it, waters and feeds it. It then has its time, and it really gets some good traction. And the DAF goes, you know what? This thing's now really gonna rock, and now we want to spin it off and create, say, a foundation.
So for me, I don't understand the question because structurally it's mixing apples and zebras.
Okay.
And I wonder.
I think so as well. I think in that scenario, you might use DAF funds to, as you say, water it to help it get back to a point of marketability. But I think the original investors would hold on to that IP and then maybe use their DAF funds or others to support that watering and then relaunch it at a future date. But I don't think there's a use case for just putting the IP in the DAF. That's not. It's, as John noted, it's for funds or something that has some sort of, as I said, marketable value or appraisable value, that kind of thing.
Got it.
Well,
Thank you.
So maybe you should talk about, it doesn't have to be money. It could be stock, or it could be real estate, or it could be art, anything with capital appreciation. But the expectation is that asset then is sold and then
can be liquidated. That's exactly right. That at some point in the future, it can be liquidated. That's where I thought you were going with the question, that you were could I donate, stock that someday would have a liquidated value? And the answer is sure, but it's not someplace to hold IP per se.
Right. But I guess, sorry, I didn't mean to take up the whole thing here, but it's more like, say you have this company, it's got this good idea, and you decide to donate all the shares of the company into a DAF. It sounds like that's a possibility.
So we certainly have parties donating into a DAF. The biggest use case is the one that John was alluding to earlier, and that is if you have an exit coming up and you're like, hey, I recognize my shares are going to sell and I'm going to have a capital gains impact on my tax bill. What you can do instead is take those shares, donate them into the DAF, and allow them to get exited in the DAF where we don't pay capital gains. So you avoid the capital gains opportunity. The full corpus is then available of whatever portion of those shares you set aside so that you can then invest them in the next impact venture of your choice.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Excellent. All right. So because JP asked the question, we're going to move to the next couple of slides and hit on, what I sort of euphemistically refer to as the advanced class. So the next couple of things are more sophisticated usage of donor advised funds in the vein of some of the things JP mentioned. So this one's more focused on individual companies. So in the vein of what he was asking, hey, I love the idea of using my DAF. In fact, for all the reasons that we talked about in the previous slides, it's probably a smart idea if I do use my DAF. But what if this thing I'm investing in this company turns out to be Google? Then I'm going to feel a little bit like a dope that I didn't, invest directly out of my portfolio. I know it's really early stage. I know it's really high risk, but it could conceivably be high reward as well. What can I do here? And so one of the things that we've pioneered are what we call impact warrants, which allow parties to ideally capture the high reward while avoiding the high risk. And the way we do this, you invest in the company with your DAF. As part of that investment, in that early stage company, if it involves warrants, as many early stage companies often do, those warrants, along with whatever equity interest, flow back to the DAF in the pro rata way it should for whatever amount was invested. And we allow the original donor to step in and acquire those warrants out of the DAF, and sort of give you lottery ticket in the venture's upside. So the bulk of the investment is still associated with the DAF. But if there really is a pop, you now hold those warrants so that you can participate at some point in the future. So, it's
to be again very specific, a warrant is the right to buy the stock. And so you put the stock into the DAF, and then you have the right to buy it back. And so your liquidation of that stock in the DAF goes to you under the warrant terms, not under the capital gain outcome terms.
Correct. You would acquire a right in the future to buy stock at a particular, point, at a particular amount.
Are there constraints on how cheaply you can sell your own stock back to you?
Well, it's not your own. Remember, it's the DAF's. It's the DAF that owns those warrants at that point.
Yes.
And yes, there are requirements of how that has to be managed to preserve fair market value and things of that nature. But this is something we've pioneered to address exactly the issue that JP was talking, or at least one of the issues JP was talking about, which is, hey, what if I'd like some of that back end upside, or I'm hesitant to use my DAF to invest in something that could really have a huge back end upside. Now, this is company specific, and the next slide will talk about something that could be used even more broadly. But the idea here is to how do you retain a lottery ticket on the venture's upside, even if it started with an investment out of a donor advised fund.
Yeah, and JP is asking, how are warrants via the DAF similar to the warrant rights attached to the DAF investment, but not assigned to the DAF? Well, I think you just made it complicated enough, so JP has to come up and answer this directly.
I'll wait until the next slide, because I think Rick just said he was going to answer it.
All right, I'll be quiet.
Let me hit the next one. The next one's the last, so we can have open dialogue about any and everything at that point. So impact warrants is something, just to be clear, to my knowledge, we're the only ones doing this, but it is a way to once again help encourage the use of donor advised fund dollars as investment capital and impact ventures. So this one is more in the vein of, what if I want a tax deduction and a financial return, which is, I think, more in the line of what JP was asking about. And there are ways to do this. This gets more complicated, but the scenario that we tend to focus on most heavily around this question is, let's say the best use case is where you have a capital gains tax issue, or more accurately, an upcoming capital gains tax issue. So as I was saying earlier, you have a upcoming exit of a previous investment, could be from a company or a fund or a real estate deal, but it is on the horizon, and you recognize, wow, it's great news, but it's also bad tax news. You also, at the same time, have one or more, impact investments, either directly or through a fund, that you would like to be making. And you'd like to, of course, offset those capital gains and maximize your own ROI. We can structure things where you can donate those previous investment shares into a specialized trust structure, get some immediate tax deduction. When that exit occurs, the trust and the nonprofit that we're working through don't pay the capital gains, just like the DAF that John was talking about earlier. So the full value is preserved in the trust for investment into that company or that fund or whatever it is. And then as the returns get paid, they come back in a pro rata way to that trust, so that they can then flow out to the original donor or their designated beneficiaries per the terms of this trust. It says advanced for a reason. This gets far more complicated. We typically preserve this for like 7-figure or more type transactions where there's like I said, a meaningful exit coming up that's going to have a substantial capital gains issue. But this is very much a way to say, hey, I want some tax deduction, but I'd also like to participate in some upside of what I'm investing in. And this is a great use case in funds, JP, as well as individual companies, but particularly powerful where there's a capital. It doesn't have to have a capital gains. That's not a requirement, but its impact is far greater when there is a capital gains tax issue on the horizon.
Did that get your answer, JP?
Yeah, I would just add, it seems like what you've created is a new instrument, the warrants, attached to the DAF investment, and you've been able to split them from the DAF and create the warrant upside to the donor, which is very creative, and congratulations.
Yeah,
That's
that last
clever.
slide is exactly what
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
This is actually, this particular slide, this is not an uncommon scenario that I've described here in this number 6 within the private wealth management world. The difference is how it's being used around the idea of impact investing and facilitating impact investing. That is not something that has traditionally been used in this way in the private wealth management world. But we are helping share this concept and show its applicability to impact funds and impact companies.
Does that work, JP? Anything else you want to ask? All right, good.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna let's move on for anything and everything. I obviously I haven't been able to look at the chat. I know there's a variety of questions that popped up there as well. Happy to answer any questions on any of this.
Can you lower your slides and then we'll have a group discussion.
Okay, so I just stop sharing, you mean?
Stop sharing, yeah. There we are as a group. So let's go back to my little hypothetical 13-year-old who's all precocious and doing this thing. And in the process of doing the fundraising and doing the investing, they don't actually get paid, right? So there's no money going to the advisor, right? Is there pathways where people could set up funds that actually they got paid to do that work?
Yeah, John, it's a great question, and I'll reiterate it so everyone's on the same page with John here. He's saying, hey, look, if I wanted to aggregate donated funds and then sort of serve in that quasi fund manager role where we're then investing them in one or more impactful companies, how might I do that? And certainly if you did it where people are just putting money in your DAF, that's great. You can do that, but you can't get paid because that's not how DAFs are set up. However, and this has been alluded to in a couple of those slides, including the last one. We also run impact programs where we stand up sort of purpose-built nonprofits that allow parties to raise money. Often it's fund managers, and this is probably most applicable to JP's world. Often it's fund managers that allow funds to raise capital, philanthropic funds into the nonprofit that can then be used to invest directly in the fund or in specific deals or individual deals. And in that scenario, going back to your question, John, that individual could become like the nonprofit's fund manager, where they're able to raise money into the nonprofit and then deploy those funds out of the nonprofit as investments and get compensated as basically a party working for the nonprofit that's been set up, but a nonprofit focused on making investments. That's the best scenario. And the additional reason it's the best is that you're also not limited to just raising money from DAFs. Then you can raise foundation grants, corporate sponsorship dollars, direct contributions from anyone that wants tax-deductible contributions, and be in that fund manager position. And we manage parties doing exactly that. Now, most of the parties we manage have actual impact investment funds that they are using those philanthropic dollars to help support. Invest where the nonprofit becomes an LP in the fund, basically. You can actually just run the fund out of the nonprofit if you prefer, particularly if the only money you're raising is philanthropic.
Right. So it's possible for a nonprofit that has a mission to create, better food systems or better education for girls or whatever, to build a nonprofit, use the nonprofit generating income mechanism to put things into it, and then to use that money to make the impact in the world, not by hiring people to do stuff, but investing in companies that do stuff, and then take essentially some kind of fee against that as a way of paying for the staff work, essentially.
Yep.
Yes.
That's exactly right. And maybe there's even a bonus, based on success or things of that, things that appear like a management fee, but aren't in a traditional sense.
So you could do essentially functionally a 2 and 20% fee and a 20% carry kind of thing, but you'd have to decorate it a little bit.
Yeah, I was about to say, the way we do it is there are equivalents, but we're really getting into the weeds here. But it's not exactly the 2 and 20. It's more in the vein of what you were saying, find ways to compensate the staff and to reward performance.
Right. And we sort of walked through in some detail the structure, but we haven't gone through the costs. Can you talk about what the costs would be to set one of these up? You know, if I raise, $2 million into this fund that I'm doing, where does all of the money go? Do I get to put 100% of those $2 million into mission?
No, it's a good question. So whether it's the Donor Advised Fund or the other structure, nonprofit structure we were just talking about, in general, and there's some nuance here, but in general, there's a 2% annual fee based on assets under management. So whether those are assets in a donor advised fund that you're investing or doing whatever with, or they're assets in one of these nonprofit vehicles, it averages around 2% annually.
Right. So every year, 2% of the fund that's been deployed that's still held as an asset is charged.
Yeah, whether it's deposited, waiting investment, or has been invested, those are assets under management. There's also a fee if you just make a philanthropic, like a one-time grant to someone, a philanthropic, there's a fee associated with that, but it's sort of either or, right? Because if you made a donation, those funds are no longer assets under management, they're just gone. And so there's a fee to handle when they go out the door. We don't charge any fee when money comes in the door. It's only, either an annual fee because it's being used and invested, or there is a fee if it's just being dispersed out as a grant or something in that vein.
Yeah, cool. Anybody have any other questions they want to think about?
Just a real basic question. Rick, are you aware that other countries do something similar like DAFs? Because, I run around Mexico and I run around Brazil and, some other jurisdictions, European jurisdictions. And I'm just sort of curious about that. It's more of an
I don't know. I wouldn't say about DAFs per se. That's a term we use, Donor Advised Fund. But what I would say is many jurisdictions around the world have tax regimens that reward philanthropic giving in one way or the other. And the question we get asked sometimes is, hey, and I even ask, because we deal with a variety of folks in Europe and other parts of Latin America and Asia, hey, if I talk to a donor here, because the DAF is in the US, can I still take it off my take it off my taxes, wherever that is, in the UK and I'm always like, I'm not a tax expert in your particular or that particular jurisdiction. You need to ask that question yourself to find that out. But if there is a reward of making a philanthropic gift from a tax perspective, then it's relevant almost anywhere. And what I tend to note is, look, if I tomorrow make a donation to a charity in Africa, a legitimate registered charity in Africa, I can take it off my US taxes, and I will. And I think the reverse is true as well. If I were a donor in Africa making a donation to a US charity, depending on their tax jurisdiction, they probably have some sort of reward for that tax deduction type equivalent there as well. But it really it's specific to each jurisdiction of how they handle philanthropic giving as to whether it's relevant or how relevant it is to them. I will say the US has one of the most progressive tax schemes as it relates to encouraging philanthropic giving. And, that's not always shared in every part of the world.
Yes, Brad, go ahead.
So Rick, I've got your website up, and my question is, how do you go incredibly interesting concept to people who are going to give the donations, the contributions, the philanthropic contributions? How do you go about steering those people with the money to put the money into the system that you're building here?
Yeah, it's a great question. And what I would say is, our approach is to, because all we're really focusing on is impact investing and in enabling more funds to flow towards that is educating people that this is something they can be doing. And as was noted earlier, it is often not appreciated that this is a path that even exists. And so, it's an education play of saying, if this is something you want to do, there are ways to do it. I mean, we deal with parties every day that are like, I had no idea I could be using the money in my Schwab charitable account to be investing in that very cool company or that interesting entertainment production or whatever. But I learned about it through the company leader or the theater producer who we've educated to go out and ask those same questions from whatever it was, slide to 2 or 3. Like, asking those questions is how that education occurs for both parties. One, you find out who has the money that they've set aside or planning to set aside. And 2, they find out they could actually be using it in a way they had no idea they could be using it.
Yeah, no, I just think this is an incredibly interesting concept, particularly for what I'm working on. So I'll send you a note. And
I think there's another thing you should be aware of, Brad.
Okay.
Lots of people do tax planning and their accountant says, by the way, you can do this. And then they do it to get the tax thing. And then they forget that they did it and the money's sitting over in that donor advised fund thingy over there. And there's lots and lots and lots of undeployed things.
That is why we have $250 billion stuffed inside of donor advised funds right now, because people got their tax deduction. Basically it's a set it and forget it. And they have forgotten about deploying it. They've gotten the front end benefit and they're like, I'll get to that. I'll make those decisions. I'll make those allocations, but it's not foremost in their mind. Honestly, we come across companies all the time that are asking these questions. We've taught them to ask, or fund managers are asking these questions. And the response from the investors they're talking to are, wait, I think we do have one of those. Let me look in and see look, we've got a few $1 million sitting in one. We didn't even know, we're not even thinking about it as capital that we could be deploying. And meanwhile, Schwab and Fidelity, they have it in their own mutual funds. They're investing it in their own products and they're not encouraging these parties to have that money leave the door. And so, unless you take a proactive stance, unless parties are educating each other, they're not going to be able, no one's going to be taking advantage of it.
So to follow that a little bit, they put it in, they forget about it, and then they die. What happens?
Typically DAFs roll over to their children or grandchildren, and because there's no requirement the money ever come out, I mean, theoretically it never comes out, right? It just rolls from generation to generation and the money always stays there. Yet another reason to ask the question.
So it could be that the children don't even know that it exists and they don't know that they have they got a letter, it's sitting on a shelf somewhere and not even aware, right?
That would not surprise me at all. So on some level, and this goes back to the family investment education side, for those sort of next gens, we often talk about, hey, find out, does your family have a donor advised fund or some equivalent like a private family foundation, and how they're using that money today? Because, it's not uncommon for us to, in the impact space, to be working with next gens who want to invest in things, who would like to see more done in the social enterprise world or funds, and getting parties within their family to agree, older generations to agree those are good places to deploy funds can be challenging. But one of the things we always say is ask them if they have donor advised funds already set aside or private family foundation funds already set aside, because those can be great funds to allow everyone to win. You have money to invest and deploy. They get to get you off their back talking about that impact stuff. And it's not money that has any, meaningful impact on their portfolio.
Right. So there's a bunch of quiet people down on the bottom of my screen. Anybody want to ask a question? Gary, did you learn anything?
Yeah, John, I didn't know anything. I mean, I didn't have any knowledge at all before this presentation. So I made some notes and I'm going to think about it.
So you have a company that comes in that does clean tech, and they go and they ask people for investment. And they also ask, by the way, there's another asset class that you have that might apply to this. And then they can double or triple the investment from that person. We saw with what was the name of it? Green Canopy Homes, where they had 2 different asset classes and they asked for investment in the main company and they got angel percentage. And then they had another set of loans that were different structure, and they got a different asset class, and they got 3 times as much money in that part of that investment than the equity investment, because people understand loans, but they don't understand equity. So different asset classes, you might actually amplify the amount of money by more than a factor of 2.
I will mention that I've got a very good friend who has been very successful, and I'm going to tell him about this because I know he's not aware of it.
Yep. All right. Rick, can you tell us the difference between a foundation, like a family trust kind of thing, and a foundation and a donor advised fund? There's just entity names that you were using that I'm not sure everybody's got.
So up until a decade ago, private family foundations were the typical way that parties of wealth created, tax deduction vehicles that they could use to manage their taxes in a variety of ways, and then have money set aside to make philanthropic donations subsequently. Foundations have a lot of requirements. You have to disperse 5% of your assets each year. There's a variety of reporting requirements. They're not anonymous. Sometimes the tax benefits are not as advantageous as DAFs. Because of that, DAFs have skyrocketed in use, and foundations have not had the same, growth. But that doesn't mean there's not a lot of private family foundations out there that you should be soliciting funds from, and not just as an investor, because it can often be very difficult for those groups to invest in individual companies or funds with emerging managers or things of that nature, but actually through their grant dollars. That we have mechanisms to allow you to be able to absorb the grant side from those private family foundations. And that's why, while DAFs are always the area that we focus most heavily on, because we run one, and we want to encourage people to educate parties about them, there's still a lot of money in private family foundations as well. And they get set up every day. It's not like that's a dead concept. I mean, it's just DAFs are growing even faster as the philanthropic vehicle of choice, but there's lots of money in them. And once again, unless you solicit it, you're not likely to find it, if that makes sense.
Yes. So Jonathan is asking how you activate the people about this offer. So Jonathan, you want to ask the question directly?
Sure. We'll just use Seattle Foundation because you mentioned it, John. Large organization, right, in the Seattle area that provides advisory services to those donors. They're using it for the vehicles and purposes in which you understand and you've expressed. And then they're saying, hey, here's a list of organizations that have been vetted and we might recommend for you to apply these. Now, your offer is very different, but I'm just wondering where LOHAS sits in that kind of services and not non-traditional DAF invest donations. Maybe the last 2 words were wrong, but
if I understand your question, parties come to us to stand up a DAF because they learn that they could be doing impact investing with it. And wherever their DAF is currently located, that DAF sponsor won't let them do that, or at least won't let them invest in the particular deal that they did, or there's some rigmarole about getting it pre-approved, or hey, they'd like to invest in it, but they don't hit the minimum investment amount that they want to deploy. So those are the parties that come to us. And so they typically come to us knowing what they want to invest in. And they say, hey, so-and-so told me I could be using your, and as I think I said earlier, we'll stand up a new DAF for them. We'll move their money over from Schwab or their community foundation or wherever it is, and we'll facilitate that investment in the deal they want to do. Now, after they do that, they are often like, well, heck, that was fun. Why haven't I been doing that for the last, 5 years? What else you got? And then, we try to help guide them towards things they care about and whatever their threshold of interest are, and help them see other opportunities, not terribly dissimilar from what you were saying that particular foundation did, but we're presenting investment opportunities that align with their investment interest around their areas of impact and amounts that they're interested in investing and things of that nature that might be relevant, because that's what we want to encourage. I mean, that is our focus, is encouraging impact investing out of your donor advised fund. If they want to make a donation, we'll do that too, but that's not typically why they show up at our doorstep. They show up because they've heard that they can actually be doing investing.
But then
let me drive that to a specific example so that we're really concrete. So we have a an angel group in town called E8 Angels. And
Mhm.
E8 Angels is seeing 3 or 4 climate tech companies a month. You take those climate tech companies that are vetted in some way from E8 and you say, by the way, here's a climate tech thing around solar. I know you like solar. So this one is an interesting one, and you recommend a startup investment.
Well, what I would say is if a donor who's also an angel at E8 comes to us, they already know what they want to invest in. Like they
Right.
are
No,
already,
I'm asking the other question, right? Because he's saying they give a list of possible places to do donations, and they're basically advising entities to invest in, right? Even though it's a donation. But we're talking about angel investing into some impact thing. Do you give a list of vetted alternatives?
well, I'd be cautious about using the word vetted.
Yes. No,
we're
I
not
mean,
doing
that's
due
the sharp edge
diligence.
that I'm hearing.
Yeah, we're
right?
not doing due diligence on these companies in a traditional sense. We are looking to see, are they impact? Are they offering investment terms that are reasonable and market rate? And then we're looking for the donor to make decisions on where they want to invest. Is it a good for them? Because ultimately, it's their DAF dollar. I mean, it's not legally their DAF dollar, but it's the money over which they have advisory rights. And if they want to invest in that company, then we're going to facilitate them investing in that company as long as it seems reasonable.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And I noticed that Laura asked a similar question on that as it related to investing in companies like that weren't in the US. And that is absolutely fine. Once again, it's the same criteria. Is it a market rate, investment? Are the terms reasonable? Is it the same terms that are being offered to other normal investors that aren't donor advised fund investors? And if the answer to all those is yes, and obviously if it's mission driven, that's embedded in her question. Yes, I mean, we'll invest anywhere in the world and have invested all over the world.
Cool. Jonathan, you had another question I interrupted. Go ahead.
I was just going to lean in and ask more about the facilitation point of your services. I understand that it's not tip of the spear when they come to you because they usually have an idea. But then for future, like, to be transparent, are you accepting like pitches or conversations with organizations that are impact driven companies?
Absolutely. However, I would say we're not making any promises because it's really driven by our donor. So if the donor says, hey, what do you have that's like this? And we love having things sort of in the inventory, if you will, that are like, hey, this company or this fund or this project was shared with us that seems to align well with what you're interested in. Take a look. And that's largely what we're doing. We are connecting those dots. We're not saying this is a great investment, you should make it, because we're not their investment advisor per se. We're just saying, based on the surface of what we can tell, this seems to align with your interest. Why don't you take a look and see if this is the kind of thing you do? And so, yeah, we have a variety of funds and companies and projects that have submitted information to us, really dozens and dozens, and we try to bucket it and share where appropriate.
And what happens when it becomes thousands and thousands now that Jonathan knows it exists?
And if you see Jared just on the chat, just noted where you can send your information to.
I'll keep it our secret. No.
What was that, John?
I was commenting on John's comment about, now you're going to receive thousands of pitches.
That's fine. We would love that, as long as it's impact. I get stuff every day from parties who clearly have no idea what we do, that are talking about their, AI, fintech, is going to change the, is going to be the hottest thing. And I'm like, you haven't even gone to our website? Like, all we do is impact. That's the only thing we focus on.
10 to 20 of those a day. It's just annoying as hell. All right. So, Ashkash, you came in late. Got any questions? No. Tiffany?
Hey, John. I was just listening in. No questions right now, John. I'll follow up with you.
All right. Yeah, I think there's some interesting things here. Tiffany, you have any thoughts?
I'm so sorry. I am actually at work. I'm trying to listen in. So I really appreciate the opportunity just listening to the material today. Thank you.
Fair enough. Thanks. Just want to create opportunity for voices. I see Evan's hand up. Evan, you want to turn on your camera? Yeah.
Yeah, my question was, so in terms of management fees are for the assets under management, even when they're invested, are those management fees tax deductible?
I'm sorry, say again, because I want to make sure I'm understanding your question.
The 2% that's charged for holding it, are those tax deductible?
No, remember that this is money you've already given away. You've already gotten your tax deduction. So let's say you gave $100 to your DAF, you receive $100 tax deduction. What happens inside the DAF, that's where the fee is taken. So then after 1 year, if you just didn't touch it, you'd have $98 there that you could invest. That's where it comes out of, but you don't get an additional tax deduction whether you deploy that money and it turns 100 into 1,000 or it turns from 100 into 5. It doesn't impact your original tax situation in any way. You have your $100 tax deduction.
Yeah, I don't mean on the capital gains, like, and in terms of the management fee. So let's say I put a bunch of money into a DAF and then immediately invested all of that money into some charitable organization. Yep. And then now those assets would still be under management.
Correct.
And so they'd be getting a fee, and then that fee would be charged to me. And then
no, it's retained from the money. So just to get really in the weeds on fees, let's say you donated $100 into your DAF and you wanted to invest as much as possible out of your DAF into a impact investment fund. And for whatever reason, they accepted a $100 investment. Of course, none of them do, but if they did, we charge 2% a year, but on long-term investments, meaning investments where the returns aren't going to occur till, 4 or 5 years, 6, 7, 10, whatever it is years, we retain 3 of those. Technically, our administrator retains 3 years of those fees up front. So 2% for 3 years, so ultimately 6%. So in our hypothetical here, we'd invest $94 into that impact investment fund and basically take an IOU on years 4 and years 5. And if in year 6, it say returned $120 on your $94 investment, we would take years 4 and 5. So we take $4 more off the top of that. So now there's whatever, $116 in your DAF for the next investment that you're going to make. That makes sense.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, and any other thoughts or questions, Jesse?
I was just scrolling through, John, in the chat here, and I see that Jackie from Raised Green was noting that we had invested in one of their platform companies out of our Donor Advised Fund. And so kudos to what they're doing at Raised Green. Great example of companies that are good fits for investments out of your Donor Advised Fund.
Cool. Any other thoughts that people want to share or questions you want to ask?
Thoughts to share?
Yep.
We utilize DAFs in significant ways to simplify the tax complications. I think super valuable. So if you have a company, we have a company that does $100,000 in donations a year, or a group, but to 7 different organizations, that they get one receipt. They make the donation to the DAF and they can put that in their tax processes, and they don't have to manage it after that.
And they don't have to deploy it all at once either. They can put it in and then deploy it when they need or want, even years later.
Yeah, and as it relates to the upcoming exits on capital gains, we don't always know exactly when those exits are going to occur. The idea is to get them in the philanthropic vehicle before it occurs, but it's not uncommon for us to be sitting on things like shares for a long time waiting for that exit to occur, or art that, hey, it's not the optimal time to sell it, let's wait 2 years to the market's better. All of that stuff is fine. You're just trying to either obtain a tax deduction sooner or manage those capital gains whenever they may come.
And that applies to crypto as well as art.
Definitely. Crypto's a great thing to make a donation with, when it's high, right? I mean, when you can maximize that tax deduction. Yeah, Laura, I think has a question.
Okay. Yeah, Laura.
I was wondering about any regulatory risk. So I know the IRS is kind of keeping an eye on DAFs. I don't know what the latest is though.
Yeah, the IRS's interests are more tied to just sort of general public furor around the fact that money goes in and it doesn't come out, which obviously we're a little furious about ourselves. When, we I think even say on our website somewhere, if you want, to have your money held and not do anything with it, please stay at Fidelity or Schwab. Parties that come to us, we want parties who want to invest their money in these sort of private sector impactful companies. And we want to help do that. Most of the regulatory furor right now is this whole I can put money in and it'll never come out. And so there are desires around what shouldn't there be annual requirements of money coming out, like with a foundation, or some like you can't hold it through your lifetime, like to what John was just talking about when parties pass away. Those are the kinds of things that I think the IRS is starting to scrutinize.
Yeah. Evan?
And we welcome it. That would be fantastic, but we're going to help people regardless.
Yeah, so I just want to act in terms of like impact investing, like investing in diverse founders. Would that be one of the impacts that was supported?
Absolutely. In fact, if I had to pick one area that is most heavily focused on our work, that's it. Climate would be a close second, but that is right at the top of the list.
And then another question.
Creating new diverse investors would also qualify.
Yeah, diversifying the investor pool. John and I have talked this in the past. One of the real early motivations for us doing what we're doing was helping women-focused investor circles where women were investing in other women founders that were trying to do things. And there were like membership fees to the investor club. And we were like, hey, are parties paying their membership fees using their donor advised fund? And they were like, no one's even crossed that. And we're like, oh, it should be, because there's no legal reason they shouldn't be. And we looked around and nobody would let you do that. We're like, oh, that's a problem. And so a lot of genesis around us getting into this was us finding barrier after barrier of things that were preventing parties from doing more impactful investing and trying to find ways to unlock these philanthropic funds to facilitate that. But yeah, it's gender, it's diversity, and it's the company leaders, it's the fund managers, in any vein in that way to help money that is traditionally not flowing in those directions get going in that direction.
So to that end, right? So I've started an angel syndicate focused with the impact investment thesis on diverse founders. How do I solicit people's DAFs, essentially? How do I get someone to say, hey, you're going to be paying these taxes. How about you put it in a DAF and then put it in my organization to invest in diverse founders? Or how do we put it in an SPV to invest in a specific diverse founder, so forth? Like, how do you initiate that conversation? Do I like call Rick and have Rick talk to my group of people?
We're happy to give talks, but it really goes back to, I think, what was that second use case, which is you have to ask the question of them. Like when you're talking to someone about supporting the kinds of things you're investing in, ask them, do you have a donor advised fund? Do you have a private family foundation? Are there funds that you're planning on set aside philanthropically? And if the answer to any of those is yes, did you know that those funds could be used to invest in one or more of the companies that I'm syndicating investment in? Because almost invariably, they do not know that. And so you are doing them a favor by educating them around that, because otherwise, it's going to end up in a mutual fund investing in Exxon and Monsanto, and they won't even know that themselves.
And then one final thing. So I've got a house to sell, right? What's the best way to get the capital gains on that into a DAF?
Well, I don't. That's a good one. That's not one I've heard. The challenge with that is that you would have to put the home on some level or some interest in the home in the DAF. And I suspect that's feasible, but I've never heard that on a residential side. We've heard it on a commercial building side. Like frequent example is, hey, I have this building. It's worth $10 million. I've depreciated down to zero. If I sell it, I'm going to get hit with a $10 million capital gains, or the equivalent of a tax on $10 million. What can I do? If you don't want to do the 1031 exchange, if you don't want to take that money from your home sale and put it in the next home, then you can certainly take the interest in that building and put it in a donor advised fund or some equivalent and have it for future investment out of that DAF. And we won't pay those capital gains, because of what we've already talked about. But I haven't heard it in the context of a home before.
Yeah, so I want to highlight some edges to what he said, right? I have a fund that I'm running. I would like to get donations to go into my fund. I would like to get donations that go into funding the process of setting up the fund. Those are two different pathways so that I can fund my fund that's funding me. All of a sudden you've crossed the line. So you can't take your money that's in your house and put it in the tax deductible DAF and then use that to pay yourself.
You can't with a DAF, but you may be able to with the nonprofit structured programs that I mentioned earlier. That Melody talked a lot about in the last webinar. That is something that we do. Like I said, we're typically doing that to support impact investment funds, and that's very similar to what we're talking about here. That the ability to absorb donations from the fund managers themselves is, it makes that possible. And you can't do that with a DAF, but you can do it with our impact investment programs.
Okay.
So, but let's
Cool.
say so if I wanted to sell my house and I sold it, now the capital gains aren't deducted immediately. That'll come when the tax season hits and whatnot, right? And so I have that money swishing around my pocket. So I take that money and I actually put it in a DAF. And so if I put that money in the DAF, then I get to deduct that amount. No. Okay.
You can deduct that amount, but you're still paying the capital gains. If you're going to incur capital gains, the magic of a DAF is before you incur capital gains, not after. So you want to put those assets in the DAF before they create a capital gains. So whatever the interest in the real estate or the business or whatever it may be, you want it in the philanthropic vehicle before the liquidation occurs. After the liquidation, you're paying the capital gains. Now you can offset the capital gains by making a tax deductible donation, just like you could any other time. But by that point, you've already been hit with it. There's no getting around it.
Got it. But could I hypothetically retain the beneficial interest in the house and live in the house if I put it in a DAF?
We're getting into the advanced class now. We should talk about how that might work.
All right. So how do people talk about the advanced class with you?
Go to our website is a great place to start, lohas.org. And we break things into two basic buckets. One we call impact investing, which is really donor advised funds, how we can help people do more impact investing using philanthropic funds. It talks about how families can do that, how individuals can do that. It even talks about a couple of programs that are specialized, like the family investment education side, talks about social impact entertainment type investing, earn your producer's credit using your donor advised fund. That's all under that impact investing category. The other side is impact fundraising. And that's for stuff like JP was talking about, maybe even what you're talking about, which is, hey, I'm out raising money for my company or my fund, and I would like to be able to start proactively soliciting charitable contributions from any source, DAFs, foundation grants, corporate sponsorships, direct contributions, whatever it may be. And that talks about that, whether you're a company leader, project manager, fund manager, social impact entertainment producer, all of that is under the impact fundraising section. And that's a good place to start. And then I think each of those areas, if you have further questions, just reach out to me or click the contact us button. There's a drop down of, this is the kind of thing I'm interested in learning more on, and somebody will reach out to you and get into those weeds of whatever the specifics are that we haven't already addressed on the site.
Cool. Thank you so very much for that. I think that for the most part, people are completely unaware. And that's why I'm doing what I'm doing with the Angel Conference, right? 90% of the people that could angel invest don't know that they could, because they don't even know that asset class exists. And so we're trying to make people aware of the asset class. The Don't Quit Your Day Job website is done. How many accredited investors are there? And they've just recently posted that in the last 3 years, we've gone from 10% of the US being accredited by law to 15% of the US being accredited by law. And so that group of people has wealth that they are unaware that they could be doing things with. So there's an opportunity to teach them what a donor advised fund is. It's also an opportunity for their capital gains that they clearly have gotten in the last few years to be offset a little bit by donating to your fund that you're putting up. So let me ask you all, give you all a challenge. If you could use social media and support Rick by telling the story of what you learned today, by posting something in LinkedIn or Twitter or Instagram, if you're an Instagram fan, and just let people know that this possibility exists, that would be really interesting. Is there a blog post or YouTube or something that they should refer to?
Well, we have a LinkedIn page and we can grab that. And I mentioned the website. I would also say, while clearly we're looking to grow our business and we very much appreciate just conceptually letting people know that these funds can be used in this way is a very important piece of education. There's a lot of money sitting on the sidelines that could be better deployed as investment capital in socially and environmentally impactful ventures. And unless folks like you go out and share those stories, and that the capacity to do that exists, nobody knows, because where they have their money housed, largely they don't want them to know. And so it's up to us to share those stories.
Yep, absolutely. So thank you all for coming. I'm a little bit behind on posting the workshops, but I will update them here once I get back in the US. And we will continue to do 2 or 3 workshops a week all the way through the rest of next year. Thanks for coming, and look forward to seeing you at future workshops. And thank you so very much, Rick. Really an amazing opportunity.
Thanks. Well, John, thank you for having me. Really appreciate it. Great questions from everyone. Hopefully you learned something, and then even more importantly, hopefully you can apply it at some point in the near future.
Yes, we'd love it if everybody could deploy it in the future. Thanks so much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.